The way we frame history annoys me. In the part of the world where I live, most of the time we barely focus on things before the 20th century and a couple Western nations. This makes sense. We probably should focus on the things that are most useful to us, or the recent past and important countries near us. Everyone, me included, knows less history than we probably ideally should. However, this does mean that there are some countries with absolutely amazing histories that no one really talks about. This video is to rectify that. Something to keep in mind is that I'm focusing on countries that have long periods of fascinating histories. Lithuania, for example, was absolutely incredible in the late Middle Ages. It was the largest country in Europe, and they were the last major pagan area in Europe as well. However, if you cut out the 14th and 15th centuries, Lithuania doesn't have much to differentiate from every other nation in that area. Similarly, this list is biased towards non-European nations. This is since my fan community is already mostly Western, and most people here already know European history pretty well. It's also ended up being heavily biased towards Africa, since Africa tends to be the area Western audiences know the least about. The people who talk about Eurocentrism are onto something. However, ironically, most of the time they end up being just as Eurocentric as the people they decry. It's just that the West has moved from being the saint to the devil of their story. This means that large parts of the world sadly slip through the cracks of historical narratives. Similarly, the world is such an amazing and big place that not every country with an incredible history can get onto this list. This was either since I was unenlightened as to your nation's amazing history, or that I thought it didn't make the very competitive cutoff. Please don't take this as an insult to your national identity. Also, every nation's history is really long and complicated, and I'm not going to do the full histories of any of these countries justice. Similarly, I don't have perfect knowledge of history, and will thus leave out some really interesting aspects of these countries' histories just because I don't know them. So, with that out of the way, let's start. I consider my digital privacy quite valuable, since, my job is literally online. If a thug steals my 1,000 plus maps, it'll take me a couple years to remake them. This brings us to our sponsor, Surfshark. They sell VPNs to protect your digital life with industry-leading methods like uncrackable encryption and providing IP link protection so people will never know where you are. They also provide IP leak protection so no one knows where you're really coming from. Surfshark is based out of the British Virgin Isles, whose laws allow a no-log policy, so they don't keep any data on you. For a lot of new timers who don't want to get stuck into a really complicated new service, Surfshark is very fast and easy to use and install. If you're a traveler or live in a country where Netflix is blocked or a certain show you like is blocked, you can access any country's digital library. I really hated, for example, when Peep Show was taken off US Netflix. They also come with a 30-day money-back guarantee if you don't like the service. Click the link in the description to get a Surfshark VPN and enter the promo code WhatIfAltHist for 83% off and 3 extra months free. Number 11. Afghanistan. This one comes so low on the list since most people already know the most unique part of Afghan history. How they were continually able to chew up really powerful invaders like the Soviets, British, and Americans. It's shocking to hear how the British in the mid-19th century, at the height of their power, were forced to make a Napoleon-like retreat from Kabul with barely any survivors. The Afghans are some of the toughest warriors of all time, and this is represented in how they've been mercenaries since the dawn of time. The Afghans have invaded India something in the range of 20 times and have only lost somewhere in the range of twice. Afghanistan has been the basis of countless empires, whether the Kushan, Mughal, Ghaznavid, or Huna. Afghan cities like Herat and Kandahar were at the center of the Silk Road. One of these empires you might not know about is the Greco-Bactrian, and this was a Greek-speaking state based in modern Afghanistan that lasted past the birth of Christ. They imported Greek culture into India, so when the British colonized northwestern India in the 19th century, they were shocked at how the native statues of Buddha looked like the ancient Greco-Roman statues of Apollo they were so familiar with. Similarly, they were militarily more powerful than you probably think. Probably the most underrated great conqueror of all time was Demetrius, who, based out of Afghanistan, conquered over 1,000 miles into India, nearly all the way to modern Bangladesh. Number 10. Sudan. Sudan has a surprisingly long history. It goes back to the Kush of the ancient world, which conquered Egypt and imbibed its culture. Sudan has more pyramids than Egypt does. Later on, when the Arabs tried to conquer Sudan in the 7th century, they failed so badly that they paid tribute to the Nubians, as they were called, for the next 800 years, so they wouldn't bother Arab Egypt. Nubians were prized as some of the best fighters in the Muslim world. Until the 14th century, Nubia remained Christian while all the nations around it, with the exception of Ethiopia, were Muslim. Sudan became controlled by Egypt in the 19th century, from which the Egyptians launched their own scramble for Africa before the Europeans, reaching as far as the Democratic Republic of Congo. After the Egyptians lost control, Sudan became controlled by a radical messiah figure in the 1890s called the Mahdi, who instilled a horrific theocratic state that killed millions. The British then defeated him and killed the Mahdi. When Sudan gained independence, the North and South, whose only real shared history was of the North enslaving the South, were roped into the same country. Sudan was one of the bloodiest nodes of the Islamic slave trade, with majorities of the slaves dying in the long hikes across the desert before reaching Cairo. Sudan had an issue of the Northern horsemen raiding the South, which occurred in the 1890s. Sorry, I read that wrong, 1990s. In the 1990s, North Sudanese horsemen were still enslaving the Southerners. Number 9. The Democratic Republic of Congo. This place is huge. It's about the size of Western Europe. We all know about Leopold's atrocities here and how the Belgians killed 8 million Africans in an exploitive endeavor to extract as much rubber as possible. However, that only scratches the surface of the Congo's history. The Belgians got this huge area since everyone else in Europe desperately wanted the Germans to not take it, and the Belgians were found to be the most inoffensive power that would do nothing to disturb the European balance of power. Interestingly enough, once the Belgian government took over the Congo from it being Leopold's personal possession, they ruled it in a highly humane manner. The Belgians, for the 60 years after Leopold, were actually known as the best European colonial power to live under. The Congo's huge size means it has a highly regional history. For example, in the Middle Ages, the coastal strip was the highly developed Congo Kingdom, about the size of England with 2 million people or twice the Netherlands' population, with a centralized government that was capable of beating back the Portuguese a few times. Lots of slaves came from this area, and the classic drum beat behind American rock and roll comes from this part of the world. The southeast of the country, Katanga, is very mineral-rich and supplied the uranium that went into the atom bombs that blew up Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Meanwhile, the east of the country is so beautiful that lots of tour operators think that the second the Civil War ends, it'll become a hotbed for tourism, just because it's so gorgeous. On a similar topic, the largest waterfall in the world is not Niagara Falls, but Boyoma in the western Congo. The Congo is currently fighting the bloodiest war since World War II, although it's toned down quite a bit since around the turn of the century when it was at its apex. It was the African version of the 30 Years' War, at a certain point involving about half of Africa's countries. The Congo split into warlords, and the big reason this war continues is that the warlords are mining the cobalt that goes into your phones, and they're using the funds from that for their various warlording. Number 8. Oman. Oman is sort of like the Britain of the Middle East, the naval mercantile people geographically removed from the rest of the action, in Oman's case by the Arabian Desert. The Omanis were huge merchants in the Indian Ocean, and they were especially predominant in the east coast of Africa. From the 17th through 19th centuries, they controlled the eastern coast of Africa from Mozambique to Somalia, using Zanzibar as their nexus and capital. They monopolized the Indian Ocean part of the Islamic slave trade, thus making them one of, if not the nation that had traded the most slaves of all time. They had trade tendrils going as far as the Democratic Republic of Congo and central Zimbabwe. In fact, there's a tribe in Zimbabwe that claims Jewish heritage, and their Y chromosomes come from the Arabian Peninsula, which once had a large Jewish population, and so it's possible. This Arab colonial empire was destroyed by the British in the shortest war in all of history, lasting 38 minutes as the British turned them into a client state in order to end their slave trade. Before we hit the ad break, I'd like to have my own personal ad. What If Altist has merch? Click the link in the description for t-shirts, maps, mugs, and all sorts of this stuff. Number 7. Uzbekistan. Imagine destroying a nation so hard that it went from being one of the world's centers of trade to a mostly barely settled stepland for the next 1,000 years. This is what occurred in Uzbekistan. In the 13th century, the Mongols put the major cities of this area like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Khiva to the sword, alongside destroying the irrigation systems, turning the nation of Khorasan into a veritable desert that became settled by Turkic Uzbeks. The Khwarezmids, or native population, put up a heroic resistance under their prince Jalal ad-Din, who had an awesome military career afterwards, single-handedly forming a mercenary band and founding a kingdom in Iraq that finally drove the Crusaders out of Jerusalem. Before the Mongols destroyed it, Khorasan was a wealthy and integral part of the Islamic world. It sits in the middle of Eurasia where the roads to China, India, the Middle East, and Europe meet, which means it was a heterogeneous society with Islamic, Christian, Buddhist, and pagan influences. It sat in the Silk Road, with cities like Bukhara, Samarkand, and Khiva as some of the richest in the world. Being in the center of the map meant everyone has attacked Uzbekistan, and they've faced countless nomadic invasions from the north. The indigenous population were relatives of modern Europeans and Iranians. They were a weird bunch. They'd smoke weed, indulge in free love, have long hair, and were also some of the best fighters in the world. A really notable thing is, if you want to believe Herodotus, is that in the 6th century BC, led by the warrior queen Tamiris, they defeated the Persian Empire at its height in an epic guerrilla campaign that killed Cyrus the Great, one of the greatest generals in all of history. After this native population was replaced by the Turkic Uzbeks, they kept producing great conquerors, one of which was Tamerlane in the 15th century, one of the greatest warriors in history, sacking an area from Moscow to Constantinople and Delhi, alongside being the 4th greatest mass murderer in all of history, surpassing Hitler by 5 million deaths. Samarkand had an artistic and cultural renaissance as Tamerlane brought money and craftsmen from all over his conquests to make it more beautiful. The area was conquered by the Russians in the 19th century, who did so to stop the substantial slavery of white Russians in the area. Stalin afterwards designed the borders so to purposely go against the ethnicities and geography of the area to permanently stunt its growth if it got independence. Similarly, the Russians made cotton production the main industry, thus strangling the Aral Sea for water, effectively killing an entire inland sea. Number 6. San Marino. This is a pocket-sized nation, coming in at 60 square miles, located inside Italy. It was founded in 297 when a Christian mason fled to the hills when an insane woman claimed to be his wife. He was also escaping the persecution of Christians by Diocletian in that same time period. He there built a republic that lasts to this day. San Marino wasn't conquered by Napoleon or Italy's unification, unlike most of the pocket-sized countries like it, since it was a republic and the conquerors shared their value system. San Marino had a phase of being controlled both by their homegrown fascist and communist parties. They were controlled by one of the few democratically elected communist parties from 1942 to 1957. Number 5. Madagascar. Before we start, I once made a video about Madagascar in which Europeans were triggered by my pronunciation, saying my pronunciation was ridiculous and I should say Madagascar instead. However, I will keep saying Madagascar out of sheer bitterness and being the way it's pronounced on this side of the Atlantic. From what I can gather with the very limited knowledge I have about their native language, Malagasy, it's pronounced something like Madagascar. Madagascar is a strange nation for a variety of reasons. The first of which is that even though it's geographically very close to Africa, it's ethnically and culturally thousands of miles away. Literally, the region was settled around 250 AD by people from Java and Malaysia. On a side note, the Austronesian diaspora is amazing. Starting in modern Southeast China, they spread to Taiwan, Indonesia, the Philippines, and then across the Pacific to New Zealand, Hawaii, and Easter Island, going on voyages of thousands of miles in outrigger canoes. In Madagascar, they drove the native megafauna of giant mongoose, giant lemur, dwarf hippos, and elephant birds, which may have been the inspiration for the rock in the Sinbad myth and 1001 Arabian Nights, extinct by around 600 AD. The islands afterwards became settled by Bantu Africans around 1000 AD. It later became a base for New England's American pirates who were using it as a base to raid cargo in the Indian Ocean. It became unified in the 19th century with the Mad Queen Ranavalova, who, as an example of her madness, made her 50,000-person court go on a buffalo hunt for 3 months with poor supplies that resulted in the deaths of 10,000 of her court and capture of no buffalo. Her tyranny halved Madagascar's population from 5 to 2.5 million. The French then colonized the island, and in the 1930s the Germans had their plan to send all of Europe's Jews to Madagascar, but the French didn't agree to it. Number 4. Haiti. Something you might not know about Haitian history is that barbecue is originally from here. The land that became Haiti was originally heavily forested and inhabited by French hunters. They hunted the local feral pig population and traded it to passing Spanish ships. This style of cooking became barbecue. The Spanish didn't like these Protestant vagabonds in the area, and so cut down the trees where the pigs lived, thus forcing these people out into the sea to become pirates. This resulted in the creation of the buccaneers or pirates, which shares the same root word with barbecue, or an older French word for crate called bouquin. The pirates here often formed homosexual unions called Brothers of the Coast, and Tortuga in northwestern Haiti became the Caribbean's main base for piracy. These French pirates translated to French influence, and Haiti became a French colony. It was overwhelmingly black, and slaves were worked in the sugar plantations in some of the worst conditions in all of history. The Haitian slave rebellion is famous and rightfully so. The Haitians fought against often impossible conditions for their own freedom, becoming one of the very few slave societies ever to liberate themselves. The French sent an army of 8,000 to try to crush the rebellion, but this was wiped out nearly to a man by disease. Interestingly enough, the Polish segment of the French army detached and joined the Haitians, and there is still a Polish genetic component in Haiti. Most people don't know what happened after the Haitian Revolution, the darker side of it. The Haitians tried to colonize the modern Dominican Republic, but were driven back by an indigenous rebellion. After the war, Haiti divided in two, with the North being an oligarchy in which black leadership drove their population under the lash to work in the fields. In the South, the mixed-race population enslaved the black one. The rest of Haitian history has generally been that of poverty and repression. Two interesting moments shine out in the 20th century, being the US occupation and Papa Doc. Something very few Americans know is that the US under Woodrow Wilson militarily occupied Haiti for 20 years, partially due to political instability in Haiti, but also due to Woodrow Wilson's racism. From 1957 to 1971, Haiti was controlled by Papa Doc, one of the most brutal dictators in the Western Hemisphere, killing about 60,000. His big aim was to try to weaken the power of the mixed-race elite that controlled Haiti and put his black supporters in power. He was also a voodoo master, creating a voodoo cult of personality to pretend he was a sort of all-powerful magical wizard. He ended up being so hated and feared that people actually begrudged the US for not removing him from power, which for anyone who knows Latin American history means shit really got real. Number 3. Iceland. Iceland was at one point a libertarian's paradise. In the early Middle Ages, they had a parliamentary system called the Althing, in which all free men would gather in one place and vote over issues. Crimes were solved through systems of payment, and all the laws were read out on a yearly basis. There was no government, military, or king, and that's how the Icelanders wanted it. They settled Iceland, bringing their Scottish and Irish brides and enslaving the native Irish monks that discovered the island first, in order to escape the growing dictatorial power of the Norwegian monarchy. Iceland in the High Middle Ages was a massive center of literature, with Icelanders renowned as the best poets. Snorri Sturluson was a crafty politician who tried to simultaneously unite Iceland and make himself king, alongside writing basically the only things we know about Norse mythology. You could make the argument Snorri was the most influential European fiction writer between Shakespeare and Homer, for all the influence he had in the later fantasy and poetic genres. Iceland became a Norwegian possession in the late 13th century, followed by centuries of foreign colonial domination and depredation. Icelanders became horrifically poor as they cut down all their trees, meaning they couldn't sail outwards and were continually scammed by foreign sea captains. One of the most humiliating restrictions was that selling hard liquor to Icelanders was forbidden because they were considered too immature for it. However, the story does have a happy ending. After World War II, Iceland was able to become independent from Denmark and wealthy via foreign tourism. A final point is that they waged a cold cod war with Britain over fishing rights in the 50s through 70s, in which Icelandic and British naval forces skirmished over fishing rights. Number 2. Paraguay. Modern Paraguayan history started when a group of Spaniards in the early 16th century, trying to flee the really aggressive tribes in the Argentine Pampas, met up with the settled Guarani tribes. The 300 or so odd Spaniards practiced polygamy on a massive scale with the native women, creating the modern Paraguayan people. For nearly a century afterwards, the center of Spanish colonization in this region of South America was over 600 miles from the coast. This would be like if the Europeans colonized the United States from a base somewhere around St. Louis. Paraguay became controlled by the Jesuits, who transformed it into one of the few functioning communist states in history. This was since the Brazilian Paulistas, slaving adventurers who started around Sao Paulo and raided as far as Caracas and Quito, basically across all of South America, were enslaving the native Guarani population. The Jesuit fathers armed the natives and built fortified missions against the Paulistas, while economically sharing everything in a communist manner. After independence, Paraguay became controlled by a madman called Francisco Solano Lopez. He launched a war against Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay, or countries that combined had 27 times its population, believing himself to be the Napoleon of South America. Thus began the bloodiest war in the Western Hemisphere's history, killing upwards of 500,000 people, including 90% of Paraguay's male draft-age population. It got so bad that Lopez would wander around the capital, pistol in hand, forcing any males he could see at gunpoint to join the army. Polygamy once again became a norm after the war due to the dearth of males. If you're interested and want more information, I have a video on this topic. Paraguay then fought a war with Bolivia in the 1930s called the Gran Chaco War, which they won outnumbered and outgunned, mostly due to lack of coordination and social cohesion on Bolivia's part. It was the last great trench war in history, since neither side had tanks in number. The war was fought over the oil supply in the region, with Paraguay taking the lion's share of the contested Gran Chaco, but as it turned out, the vast majority of the oil turned out to be useless, and the part that wasn't was in Bolivia's hands. Honorary mention, the island of Pohnpei. This is not a country, but it's so weird I thought it deserved an honorable mention. This is an island about the size of London and Micronesia, or about 1,000 miles east of the Philippines. The native population has built these incredible megalithic structures in a complex canal system in a Venice-like city spanning 7 square miles. The island had a population of 25,000 in the 17th century and just 38,000 now. It just shocks me that there is this entire developed civilization on a tiny rock in the middle of the ocean. It really shows something about the human character, I just don't know what. And number 1 is Liberia. Liberia is America's forgotten colony. In the early 19th century, white Americans were unclear what to do with the liberated black population and considered sending them back to Africa. This is how Liberia was created. You can see the American heritage with place names like Philadelphia, Harper's, Maryland, Mississippi, Louisiana, etc. A group of American ex-slaves, around 12,000, set up colony there and then became slave owners themselves. They recreated the American South they came from with great accuracy, just with the local black population as their slaves. They built plantation houses in the style of the American South, danced similar waltzes, and the native black population even called them the whites. People often find examples like this, also including Haiti, of slaves recreating slave societies when they get power, as ironic, but it makes a good deal of sense. Due to illiteracy and lack of good connections, slavery was the only social system most of these slaves knew, and so it would make sense that they would recreate it when given the opportunity. Also, I don't want to minimize the horror of when Europeans enslaved Africans, which was absolutely awful and morally indefensible, but I want to make clear that being mistreated didn't make the slaves any better people, it just made them mistreated. This African-American elite ruled Liberia into the late 20th century, and development was terrible. Liberia is one of the poorest nations in the world, with slavery into the late 20th century. It was so poor that in 1955, the whole country had less than 10 miles of paved road, had 90% illiteracy, and only 2 citizens were doctors. A hobby of the president, who was named William Tubman, claiming descent from Harriet Tubman, was to drive around the capital shooting the tires out of any car that didn't pull over and salute him. Liberia had 2 really nasty civil wars around 2000. Some of the most colorful personalities involved are President Charles Taylor, who reputedly kept the bodies of his political opponents in his freezer and ate them, alongside being convicted of sexual slavery, keeping child soldiers, and acts of terrorism. General Butt Naked fought under the control of warlord Roosevelt Johnson, said to be the most evil man alive. He and his army would fight naked, and he was also known for regularly performing human sacrifices and child cannibalism. He also believed he had magic powers that turned him invisible. It honestly shocks me that this happened during my lifetime and this guy is still alive. Maybe I should say something nice about this guy now. I don't want to be on his bad side. Well, that's it. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for additional content. Or alternatively, check me out on Twitter or Patreon, like these wonderful people. On Patreon, I've got the first 11 chapters of my history of the world, as well as the first 3 chapters of my cultural history of America. In addition to that, there's all sorts of cool maps and exclusive fan videos where you can ask me what-if questions or questions about history. As always, thanks so much for watching and have a great day.